Good afternoon and welcome to the International Institute for Strategic Studies. Students of Latin America have, of course, noted that over the past couple of years there have been some quite significant political changes within domestic politics of several countries within the region, which potentially created new opportunities for the United States hemispheric engagement. As we ourselves concluded in our 2016 edition of Strategic Survey, the United States has created the basis for a new, friendlier era in its relationship with Latin America, but much rests on the outcome of the country's 2016 presidential election. At that time, Craig Deare was actually working out the National Security Council on plans to exploit those very opportunities for the United States in its neighbourhood and for mutual advantage. He is a retired military intelligence officer and a Latin American foreign area officer who served as ADA for the United States in Mexico and was senior country director for Mexico in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. His PhD is from Latin American Studies program at Johns Hopkins, I presume US-Mexico bilateral?
A little bit of that.
Yeah. He recently served as Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Western Hemisphere Affairs at the National Security Council, and he has first-hand insights into the working of the National Security Council under the Trump administration. He will speak today about the opportunities for the US in its relations with Mexico and other states of Latin America and the prospects under the current political dispensation in the United States. He will speak on the record, and then we will go into Q&A, which will be off the record. If anybody has any doubts about what that means, please come and see me at the end. Dr. Deare, please.
Great. Hey, good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for the invitation to come here. I apologize up front for my throat. Between speaking a lot and picking up a bug, it is what it is. It's normally not quite this rough, but it's a privilege to be here. And what I'd like to do, the initial purpose of my trip over was to sort of promote this new book that I wrote, the intent of which was to sort of educate a U.S. audience on the importance of the bilateral defense relationship between the U.S. and Mexico. To my great chagrin, I stopped writing in August. It came out in March. Had I just been a little more active, and maybe had it been published 6 months earlier, and had Jared had a chance to read it beforehand, we might not be where we are. But so I've got a presentation that I will scream through because it's primarily about the book. I'll get through that as quickly as possible. So sort of Mexico is a case study in terms of how the U.S. Defense Department has dealt with Mexico over the years. Which in some ways should be the best case, right? It's the most important country for a U.S. interest in Latin America. And if we manage to not do a great job with that, what are the implications for everybody else, right? But just to begin, a little bit of bona fides. It's quite something when you get a phone call from a friend on the West Coast and says something like that, dude, you're on CNN. And I said, yeah, it's been a bad weekend. He goes, no, really, go to CNN right now. And I don't think that the president even knew that I was fired. Really. I'm sure this happened at levels below him. The point is, I was at an event not unlike this with an explicit promise that it was entirely off the record. And apparently someone didn't understand what those rules were. The forensics I've done, I didn't know if they called a reporter directly or if they called the White House. It's apparent to me that they called someone in the White House, some contact. It floated up. And in terms of cachet, if you're going to be fired, a phone call from Air Force One is kind of cool. So anyway, more on that later. So this is what I came to talk about. And it's a passion of mine that I've had. So in addition to serving as an attaché in Mexico in the early 90s, I had the privilege of growing up in Mexico as a young lad. Arrived when I was 12, left when I was 18, and went to a Mexican high school the last 4 years. So I'm a bit bicultural in that sense and have an understanding and an appreciation for Mexico that most of my colleagues don't. And what I always try to emphasize when I talk to them is that if you don't understand the implications of this map, You don't understand the basis for the deep-seated distrust of Mexican society in general, and the Mexican military in particular towards the United States. This is a political map of 1824. Of course, by the end of 1847, culminating event of the Battle of Chapultepec, September 12, 13, where the U.S. buys 890,000 square miles, what is today recognized as Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, California, Colorado, Utah, parts of Oregon, for $15 million, thanks to a great deal that we got from Santa Ana. And then the Gadsden Purchase a couple years later. Again, if we don't understand that sort of Mexican, what I describe as a scar, a historical scar, at very many levels, you just can't go beyond that. And so, again, every Mexican school child knows this. Who knows how many American school children do, and if they ever did, they've forgotten it, and then they're wondering about why are the Mexicans so hard to deal with? Anyway, so I spent about 50 pages of the book talking, Mexican history 101 for gringo dummies. So they understand, what is la revolución? What does that mean? What was Porfiriato? And then I divide the book into sort of 4 basic chapters based on 4 successive sexenios after the fall. Salinas, Cedillo, Fox, and Calderón, with an epilogue on EPM. And I emphasize, what I'm trying to bring out in most of this is the role of leadership and individual decisions made by leaders who confront either domestic politics or conventional wisdom to change the status quo. And we begin, of course, with NAFTA. And even though the U.S. had been open to a free trade agreement with Mexico for years, until Carlos Salinas, as he looked around and understanding that he needed to grow his economy out of where it was, they'd moved beyond import substitution, industrialization. They had to get into a model of growth. China was not on the radar yet. Europe's far away. South America doesn't have it, so he turns north. And the Mexicans in the audience will appreciate this. I won't go into it, but it makes the point that there was a domestic political cost. Actually, let me take a second. So that's Diana la Cazadora, right? And so you can tell from the orientation that her rear end is facing north. And so the joke in Mexico at the time was, what do Diana and Carlos Salinas have in common? And the answer is, well, they're both giving their ass to the north. They are surrendering sovereignty. You go back to the map and the war, and the war is the biggest embodiment of a loss of sovereignty, and sovereignty becomes the guiding factor in Mexican foreign policy from then on. Even today, even though it's changing, Mexico is playing a larger role, which it's attempting to, which I think is wonderful, but it's at odds with their historical non-intervention policy and others' affairs. So that's that begins an economic rapprochement, if you will, an effort to bring the economies closer. And then this side is General Gordon Sullivan, U.S. Army Chief of Staff, who, curiously enough, became the first U.S. Army Chief of Staff to ever visit Mexico. In over 150 plus years of shared history, no one had ever gone. And the interesting anecdote is when he begins his job as the Army Chief of Staff, his staff comes in and briefs him and says, okay, for the next 4 years during your tenure as the Army Chief of Staff, so you're going to go to Brazil first, then you're going to go to Chile, then you're going to Colombia, then you're going to... And they lay out his plan over the next 4 years. They go away. He bumps into the briefer the next day, and he says, I noticed that Mexico wasn't on that list. And the briefer says, yeah, well, why not? Well, it's because it's Mexico. They're hard to deal with, especially the Army. They're very sensitive. The juice isn't worth the squeeze. He goes, oh, okay, yeah, fine. We're going. Set it up. So he goes. No one tells him to do it. No one tells him he can't do it. An act of leadership, he goes. And to date, he's the only chief of staff to have gone to Mexico 3 times to visit his counterpart, and his counterpart visited him 3 times. No instructions, just leadership. And that's the first sort of step to change this polite, distant relationship. And because of that visit, the gentleman, the Mexican gentleman is the Secretary of Defense, who retires, and his successor, upon Sullivan's retirement, goes to D.C. as an act of courtesy, and while he's there, invites the sitting U.S. Secretary of Defense to go to Mexico, Secretary William J. Perry. And Perry says, but prior to that, Perry had the idea, I need to go to Mexico. He makes plans to go, and the State Department says, no, we'd really rather you don't go. Why not? It's Mexico, and the military is very sensitive, and better to just let sleeping dogs lie. Don't go. So he doesn't. But when Cervantes invites him, he says, don't ask anybody. He just says, I'm going. And again, an act of individual leadership that changed the status quo. And so he goes down. The first sitting U.S. Secretary of Defense to ever go, this is in October of 1995. I should mention that when Sullivan went, I was a young attaché in the office and went around with him. And if you look at Sullivan, I mean, he's not, the poster child of the hard-edged army leader, right? And yet, through sheer force of personality and intellect, was able to change the relationship. So Perry goes down, they put on this parade for him. This is Campo Militar Número 1. You could tell off into the distance all these formations, who knows how many tens of thousands of troops go by with amazing precision. They put on the dog, so to speak. And Secretary Perry and his counterpart, General Enrique Cervantes, get along famously. Even though they don't speak each other's language, the gentleman behind General Cervantes was then Major Gerardo Woolberg, who is now a brigadier general in the Army. And the dashing young lad to the rear of Secretary Perry is yours truly, who just by blind luck showed up in the office 2 weeks before Perry went and got to be his interpreter for the trip, and so was in on every conversation between between Perry and all the counterparts. And it awakened my already deep interest in this, and it was timing is everything, just being at the right place at the right time. So that relationship goes splendidly, but then Perry leaves, he retires, and that personal tie is gone, and is the case in most of the world, but in Mexico in particular. Relationships are critical, right? And in the case of the Mexican Army, a very authoritarian, hierarchical, centralized chain of command, and if the boss doesn't say to do something, then you don't do it. And so when Perry leaves and his counterpart is gone, those initial steps at a great relationship sort of fall away. And there are issues, many of which, we just don't have time to go into, but it's a fascinating time. We have the election, without even going into NAFTA, without the Zapatistas, it's a dynamic time. The election of Cedillo with the assassination of Colosio, it's an unsettled time in Mexico. They go back to the PRI out of certainty, but then in 2000, the PRI finally loses, the PAN wins, and we get President Fox, who's elected on the 1st of December, and of course George W. Bush, 43, is elected in January. And between November of 2000 and September 10th of 2001, they visit each other 4 times, these two presidents. And great progress is being made in a number of areas, principal among which is immigration, of course. Mm-hmm. And maybe not la enchilada entera, maybe not the whole enchilada, but we're going to get progress. And then, of course, 9/11 changes everything. U.S. focus shifts towards the global war on terrorism. This is a photo of Rumsfeld and his chairman, General Richard Myers, announcing the creation of Northern Command. Prior to this, Mexico, Canada, and the former Soviet Union, now Russia, were unassigned in the U.S. Scheme of having geographic combatant commanders being responsible for interacting with countries, right? You have U.S. Southern Command for the rest of Latin America, you have Africa Command, you have EUCOM, NATO, Central Command, etc. Here they announced the creation of Northern Command. Among the many problems with this creation is that it wasn't coordinated at the proper level. And so the day prior to this, the Mexican Secretary of Defense, General Vega Garcia, had actually been in town, and he wasn't consulted. He was simply informed, oh, by the way, we're standing up this Northern Command thing. And so when he goes back to Mexico, and this is announced, he's bombarded in the press. How can that be? Is it true? Et cetera, et cetera. And General Vega Garcia, and part of the challenge was, when they made this announcement, rather inartfully, they said, the commander of U.S. Northern Command will be responsible for operations in the United States, Canada, and Mexico. Which, of course, isn't beyond not being true. It's highly offensive. And so this gentleman says, no, I'm responsible for operations in Mexico. And as long as I'm Secretary of Defense, I will have nothing to do with Northern Command. And he didn't for the rest of his 4 years in office. So again, this sort of sine wave up and down in terms of the relationship. Fast forward to 2006, 2007, the election of President Felipe Calderón, who, within an environment of increasing concerns of insecurity in Mexico, says the only way that we're going to fix this is we've got to go head on against the drug traffickers, and because I can't rely on my police forces because of their either ineptness and or corruption, I must turn to the military. So he engages with President Bush and says, I need your cooperation. Not assistance, cooperation. So we see during these next 6 years, and we can debate later the wisdom of that policy, but the point is, at those levels, at the presidential level, we begin to, that leads us to the Merida Initiative and a much greater degree of willingness on behalf, especially the Mexican military, to engage with their counterparts. Not because they wanted to, but because they were told by President Calderón, who's of course the Commander-in-Chief, you shall cooperate with the gringos, period, full stop. Don't want to hear it? Stop your whining, shut up in color, do it. And so they did. And my hypothesis is that even though you have a Mexican army in particular who is trained from day one with images of the Battle of Chapultepec to not trust the gringos for all kinds of good reasons, and that's just one example, of course. The Mexican military over time sees that there are advantages to cooperating more closely with the Americans. I think primarily because of the advantages of training. So say what you will about the American military. I would argue that they're the best trained military in the world because training is so important to them. It's part of their ethos. It's what they do. They train. They train and maintain. They train and maintain. And then they deploy and they come back and they train and maintain. So pick your sport. If we're both tennis players and we're both kind of mediocre and we play against each other all the time, we're not going to get any better. We're just going to maintain our level of mediocrity. But if you start playing with Roger Federer, I mean, he's still going to beat you, but your game is going to elevate. And my hypothesis is that by being exposed, and once they get beyond the you pinche gringo and yeah, you freaking Mexican, once they get beyond that and they start talking about soldier stuff, yeah, what weapon you to use, yeah, how do you like the grain of that bullet, and really, and they start talking about that, about what they share in common, it raises the game of the Mexican military, and they like that. to say nothing about the intelligence that they start to get, which is, of course, is key. So we see this fundamental change, and this is the 6-year period where that is greatest. We see Secretary Gates becomes the second Secretary of Defense to visit, and he visits twice. At this meeting, it's one of the first ones where we have the Mexican Secretary of the Navy and the Mexican Secretary of Defense sitting across from the U.S. Secretary of Defense and his chairman at the same meeting. And I could go on, but I won't. But again, another indication of how the relationship continues to evolve. Let me just take a second here. Secretary Gates, of course, is the consummate national security professional, but very wise, and he has this great quote. He says, in terms of how far and how fast the U.S.-Mexico defense relationship will go, he says, we must remember that the foot on the gas pedal or on the brake of this relationship must always be a Mexican foot. If they want to go faster, we'll go faster. If they want to slow down, we'll slow down. And as long as they understand that they are in control, that's his quote, I'm adding this. As long as we understand that and accept that, then we can move forward. This is a picture from the first or the second North American Defense Ministerial. So prior to, there are defense ministerials that go on across the region, something that Secretary Perry started back in '95. And there are bilateral relationships, but for the first time in 2012, Canada, U.S., and Mexico recognized that they needed to have, or it would be advantageous to have, a meeting where the Secretaries of Defense of all three countries met together. And so they do so every 2 years, and they're in fact meeting this coming weekend. And an encouraging sign, I'm jumping ahead, I'll jump back, when President Peña Nieto canceled his visit, the next week, the Secretaries of Defense, and these are the same guys, General Cienfuegos and Admiral Sullivan, and the Secretary of the Navy, were scheduled to visit with Secretary Mattis in early February. That visit was canceled because of the disruption of the presidential visit. And so they were talking about the importance of maintaining this, so that the next North American Defense Ministerial was scheduled for now, but they thought they might have to change it, either to Canada or to Mexico, just because of optics. But the good news is it's being held in Washington, and it's going forward. Now, it's not making headlines, but it's going forward. Here's a picture of General Chuck Jacoby with Admiral Sainz, and I include this picture because we've gone in a decade plus from General Vega Garcia saying, I'm not going to have anything to do with U.S. Northern Command, to now the most trusted partner of the Mexican military, both Defensa and Marina, is U.S. Northern Command. In great part due to General Jacoby, who, a short, quiet, unassuming, but very tough, a guy who had a philosophy of under-promise and over-deliver. So he would say, whenever anything was requested or put on the table, he would say, let me see what I can do, and then would meet the objective and go beyond. And so developed a great deal of trust, and it was always good. And of course, there are tangible elements. So the classic question you get from a U.S. audience is, why do we care? Why should we care about how well the U.S. and Mexico, how they get along, or how their militaries get along? Which, of course, shows their naivete. But then you say, okay, there are practical reasons. Because of that cooperation, the Mexican Naval Infantry has trained extensively with Navy SEALs and other Special Operations Forces. And under Admiral Sainz's tenure during the Calderón sexenio, they created this thing called the WIN, the Unidad de Inteligencia Naval, a very small naval intelligence unit that sort of reported directly to the Secretary on highly sensitive classified information. And they developed techniques where they would get the information, radio silence, the Secretary would call his guys, they'd get on aircraft, they'd move, and they'd take down the target. Not once, but twice with Chapo and others. So again, there are benefits to this. And this is simply a picture of General Dempsey, who was then the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, interesting piece here is that Dempsey developed a term of art on his own, nobody told him, called Dempsey's Six. Everybody's heard of the 5 Eyes, but what are Dempsey's Six? Dempsey's Six are the 6 most important defense relationships for U.S. interests. You have to buy the book to read the other 5, but one of the 6 is Mexico. Who knew? So Dempsey got it too. Not a lot of press. One of the things that you learn early on in dealing with the Mexican military, you will have much greater success if nothing of this comes out in the press. Right? That's not good, right? Because you don't, back to the Ana and her ass towards the north, you don't want to be seen as cooperating extensively with the north. It's just not good for domestic political consumption. So, finished writing the book in August. All is well. It's all good. And of course I say, and we need to build on this and move forward. And I'll answer some other questions in Q&A when I'm not on camera. But then we have the Trump effect. This is taken at a rally in Arizona, I think, if I'm not mistaken, the day after he goes to, he's invited by then Secretary of Hacienda Luis Videgaray to Mexico that caused such outrage among the Mexican public that it's difficult to describe. So I went to high school in Mexico. I've got 3 of my very closest friends are Mexicans. They continue to live in Guadalajara. And we never talk politics. Never talk politics. Just, it's not what we talk about. And even they were so offended that the Mexican president would invite someone into their country who had said such vile things. It just offended their sensibilities. Of course, when the gentleman wins the election, and Videgaray is, of course, brilliant, and now he's the foreign minister, and that same relationship with Jared Kushner was part of that initial deal. And so now we can, well, let me stop there. So we have that. So I joined I invited to join the National Security Council in mid-January, early January. And there were several meetings with the incoming National Security team with General Mike Flynn and his deputies prior to the inauguration. I start on Sunday after the inauguration. Monday morning I wake up, go into the office and say, all right guys, we got to get ready for this presidential visit next week. And so, that's not a lot of time for a presidential visit. It's the first one. It's kind of an important country. And it was like you're pushing on a piece of string in terms of trying to get some feedback from the West Wing and what's going on. And what's apparent to me now, but wasn't apparent to me then, is they kind of knew what they wanted to do, and they didn't need to be bothered by what the folks at the NSC thought. And so we're trying to do our job, and I'm still trying to figure out, do I turn right or left to go to the bathroom when I come out of my office? Because it's a big building. And then the tweeting starts, right? So this is President Peña Nieto's note about the president continuing to insist, not that we're going to build a wall, but of course that Mexico has to pay for it. Then we come up with this, and of course with that, the Mexican president has no option, just simply no option. It was funny. I'll do that off the record. Remind me to talk about who I was talking to about how we can still salvage this. And I include this because even though I've signed certain non-disclosure statements, especially on the intelligence side of the house. But just to say that of all the stuff that you read, Doria's is not completely true, but it suggests to me that she had some very good sources who at least gave her part of the official transcript. So let me stop there and go off the record. Or actually, before we do that, let me just say this. So everybody teased me about wanting to join the Trump team. And yes, I'm a Republican, and no, he wasn't my first choice, or second, or third, right? But I consider myself a patriot. I consider myself a public servant. And because I'm not lacking in ego, I convinced myself that I was sufficiently capable of going to the White House and persuading this gentleman, who clearly had never been told otherwise, who had only been told NAFTA's a disaster and it's the worst trade deal in history, and immigration is all wrong and they're stealing all these sorts of things. And perhaps with time we could educate him as to, it's rather nuanced and complicated. It's not just that simple. And so my intent was to build upon this very strong bilateral relationship with Mexico that we had constructed collectively over the last 10, 15, 20 years, bipartisan basis, Republicans, Democrats, PRI, PAN. It was truly impressive how we had managed to create this great interdependence that many of us appreciate, but obviously many others don't. And based on that, I wanted to try to encourage a re-engagement of the United States with the rest of our neighbors in the region, which in my view, and it's always hard because it's a big region and there are always distractions, whether it's Korea, Iran, China, you name it. But let us re-engage with the region because it's the neighborhood in which we all live, right? So let's deal with Cuba, but let's not over-dimensionalize Cuba. It's a country of 11 million people. And so that was my intent. And after 4 weeks, we counted our time there. Okay, this is week 3, day 2. Week 3, day 3. I mean, it was truly an exhausting time. I don't know how people are going to sustain the pace. But after almost 4 weeks at a similar event like this, I had a similar conversation. We'll talk about more of it off record. But I wasn't. I think one of the stories that came out in the press is that I said the White House was dysfunctional, and I did no such thing. I simply said that there are challenges. You mentioned the son-in-law earlier. I'll speak to that later. And so I think back to opportunities for the U.S. with the region. Opportunities were there. We had a great opportunity. The region was not the same region that President Obama had inherited. Lula and Dilma were gone. Nestor and Cristina were gone. Fidel was gone. Raúl is on his way out. Daniel is a minor player. Correa is leaving. I mean, it's a different place, right? And so with the right touch, not overly intrusive, deft, nuanced, we could have done certain things. And part of the concern is the rising China and China's role in the region. So how do we, to say China, of course, as an economic competitor, you have every right to engage with the region, of course, but we have a right to remain engaged, and so let's do that. And so that frustration, I guess, was not welcome, and I was asked to leave. And okay, now let me stop there, and we'll go to Q&A.